Welcome to our presentation of Tazama, an open-source real-time transaction monitoring system for the detection of fraud and money laundering behavior in financial transactions. Tazama was conceptualized as a key component of the Gates Foundation's Level 1 project for financial inclusion, published in 2015. The Level 1 project proposed a new low-cost payment system to support inclusive, interoperable digital payments and resulted in the development of the Mojaloop open-source software for creating interoperable payments platforms. The Level 1 project also called for a shared investment in fraud detection, and in 2019, the Gates Foundation commissioned a study by Deloitte in South Africa to catalog fraud and money laundering typologies in inclusive instant payment systems. The study included a requirement specification to develop a fraud detection system for Mojaloop. The Register of Typologies and Requirements were delivered to the Mojaloop community in January 2020, and the Typologies Register was subsequently refined into an open-source classification model for fraud and money laundering behaviors called Apricot. In late 2020, two companies in the Mojaloop community, Lexdago from the UK and Cybrin from South Africa, received a grant from the Gates Foundation for the development of fraud detection software based on the Deloitte specification and Typologies Register. Work on the system started in December with an initial proof of concept that was accepted by the Mojaloop community in January of 2021. Over the next 15 months, Lexdago and Cybrin completed the development of the minimum viable product for the fraud detection system, then called Actio, and the first version of the software was released to the Mojaloop community in April of 2022. Greg McCormick, our executive director, and the Gates Foundation immediately recognized the potential for the software to meet the growing demand for fraud prevention beyond Mojaloop, and started the process of creating a standalone, independent fraud risk management system center of excellence built around the software. The FRMS COE kicked off a beta testing program of the software with BankServe Africa and the Jordan Payments and Clearing Company with a convening in Amman, Jordan, in December 2022, which lay the foundation for a complete financial crime risk management ecosystem of related products. The Gates Foundation donated the software to the Linux Foundation in December 2023 to leverage the global reach and open source experience of the Linux Foundation to bring the software to as wide an audience as possible. Shortly after joining the Linux Foundation, the software project was branded and launched as Tazama, a Swahili word that means to look, to watch, to inspect, investigate, or examine, and embodies the activities that Tazama performs to keep financial transactions safe from fraud. Tazama released its first release as a Linux Foundation project in July 2024 to adopt recommended practices and governance and set the project up for widespread community participation and adoption. In September, Tazama was accepted into the Digital Public Goods Alliance's Register of Digital Public Goods, further cementing its role as a utility that will ensure the safety and security of digital transactions in any ecosystem. Tazama released its current version of the system, version 2.1.0, in December last year, implementing a variety of features based on feedback from our community. To date, Tazama has been deployed for 3 customers, 1 in Nigeria and 2 in Mongolia. And we have a number of active POCs and evaluations underway in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the USA. Tazama is a real-time transaction monitoring system, and this real-time capability is arguably its most important feature in preventing fraud. Suspicious transactions must be detected before they are completed to prevent the loss to the customer from occurring in the first place. The rate of recovery on scam transactions in instant payment systems is practically non-existent. Once money has been transferred fraudulently, the money is almost always lost forever. Tazama will evaluate a transaction before it completes so that the transaction can be interrupted and prevented before money changes hands, and quickly enough so that it doesn't impact your customer experience. Tazama's transaction monitoring services are accessed via an API so that Tazama can provide fraud detection as a service to any of the participants in a digital financial services ecosystem. The Transaction Monitoring Service API is built for ISO 20022 message traffic to accommodate the world's leading financial message exchange format out of the box. Tazama offers a rule-based detection engine to help organizations rapidly establish an effective fraud detection capability without the need for existing labeled data or model training. As Tazama's fraud detection performance in an ecosystem matures and labeled data is accumulated, Tazama's detection engine can be fine-tuned with artificial intelligence and machine learning to predict fraud and money laundering behavior with increasing accuracy. All Tazama's detection algorithms and thresholds are fully configurable through a secure maker-checker-enabled user interface. Users can adapt the detection behavior and effectiveness of the system as fraud patterns and trends evolve, allowing the system to keep up with criminals as they try to evade detection. Tazama can be operated centrally in an ecosystem to intercept transaction traffic that passes through a central hub via its API. The API can receive messages in ISO 20022 format, but if your native system uses another messaging format, a payment platform adapter can transform the messages into Tazama's format for seamless ingestion. In a typical centralized hub-and-spoke operation as shown here, the central hub can monitor all transactions that pass through the hub, but detection effectiveness is impeded by a blind spot in the internal transactions at linked financial services providers. Tazama solves this challenge through its Transaction Monitoring Service API. The API can be accessed by all authorized participants in a digital financial ecosystem, and hub-linked FSPs can send their internal transaction traffic to the central instance of Tazama, both to build up transaction history for more effective detection of suspicious transactions at the hub and for the detection of suspicious transactions at the FSP. When Tazama detects a suspicious transaction, and in particular evidence of fraud, Tazama can immediately send an instruction to the system that requested the evaluation to block the transaction. If insufficient evidence is found to block a transaction, but the transaction is still found to be suspicious, Tazama can send an alert to a case management system to trigger an investigation. Tazama was initially intended only as a detection engine that connects to your transaction ecosystem and integrates to your case management system, but in our early beta testing and engagement with customers, we found that operators require a more complete fraud management solution, and as a result, we are currently developing a Tazama case management system that will be available as a complementary open source component. While initially built with hub operators in mind, Tazama can also be operated separately by individual financial services providers in an ecosystem where each institution is responsible for its own detection and investigation. Tazama is free and open source software, and anyone in the world is able to view and download the source code to install the system to protect their users and their ecosystems from fraud. However, not every organization has the required skill or capacity to be able to implement Tazama by themselves. Many organizations prefer to contract with a system integrator to assist them with the implementation of Tazama, as well as the ongoing maintenance and support of the system. A system integrator will provide the necessary technical skills and expertise to ensure a seamless implementation and effective operation. Tazama can be operated by multiple participants in an ecosystem for themselves alone, or multiple participants in an ecosystem can band together and share a single instance of Tazama, usually managed and operated by a central transaction hub such as a switch, clearinghouse, or central bank, to share infrastructure, information, and achieve better economies of scale. A centralized detection capability will provide the most comprehensive detection coverage across an ecosystem if information is shared, but with Tazama's integrated multi-tenancy capability, individual participants in an ecosystem can choose if they want to share their data or keep their information entirely separate and protected in a shared Tazama instance. With Tazama made available under an Apache 2.0 license, any organization is also able to provide Tazama detection capabilities as a managed service to an entire ecosystem of related or independent client organizations or tenants, and may offer a full range of services including transaction monitoring, investigations of suspicious transactions, and even regulatory reporting. Tazama can be deployed in the cloud or on-premises to utilize your own infrastructure. Tazama only requires a Kubernetes substrate for its deployment, and if you have Kubernetes running, you will be able to deploy Tazama as well. We currently have prepared deployment scripts available for Google Cloud, AWS, Azure, and most recently DigitalOcean. On this slide, we'll show you how Tazama evaluates transactions for fraud and money laundering behaviors. Tazama receives transactions from a transaction system in ISO 20022 format and stores these transactions immediately as transaction history. Effective behavioral scoring is not possible on the strength of a single transaction alone. Any transaction monitoring system must evaluate received transactions against the past behavior of both the debtor and the creditor participating in a transaction. Tazama continuously collects transactions to serve as history for the real-time behavioral analysis required to identify suspicious, out-of-character behavior. After a transaction is received and stored as history, the event director in Tazama inspects the message to determine what kind of transaction it is, and then routes the transaction to the appropriate rule processors for evaluation. Different fraud and money laundering scenarios apply to different types of transactions. For example, peer-to-peer, funds transfers, merchant payments, cross-border transactions, and even cash withdrawals are all subject to different suspicious behaviors, and the event director ensures that transactions are routed to the specific rule processors that are appropriate for the evaluation of those behaviors. Tazama can be deployed with 33 rule processors off the shelf. These rule processors have been designed to look for suspicious behaviors in transactions and instant payment systems. Each rule processor is highly specialized and focuses only on a single behavior so that they can be deployed modularly and contribute specific behavioral insights to the evaluation. Rule processors evaluate behavior from the perspective of either the debtor or the creditor in a transaction and deliver their results to the typology processor for composition into a fraud or money laundering scenario. The typology processor receives the results from the various rule processors as they are completed and composes the results into a number of different scenarios. The combination of different rules describe different types of fraud and money laundering scenarios, or typologies, and a single rule processor result can be referenced in multiple typologies, but can have a unique impact on that typology based on the relative severity of the reported behavior. The typology processor has the ability to immediately send a blocking instruction to the transaction system if there is sufficient evidence of fraud in a transaction. All Tazama's parallel system flows are ultimately recombined into a final and comprehensive evaluation result for every transaction. If Tazama detected any suspicious behavior in the message at all, Tazama will generate an investigation alert in a simple JSON report format that will be transmitted to a linked case management system for verification and investigation. Tazama generates two levels of alerts. The first is a soft alert, or an investigation alert, which is delivered if Tazama has detected some suspicious behavior, but not enough to block a transaction outright. This type of alert is also recommended for money laundering typologies to avoid tipping off the subject of the alert. The second is a blocking or interdiction alert that will indicate to a client system that sufficient evidence of fraud was identified and the transaction should be blocked to prevent a financial loss to the customer. Typically, only fraud typologies should raise blocking alerts. Deloitte compiled a register of 272 fraud and money laundering typologies that impact instant payment systems. The Tazama project team then created 33 rules to evaluate suspicious behavior in instant payments transactions based on the minimum mandatory information available in 4 common ISO 20022 messages. With these 33 rules, we were able to compose 31 typologies from the register that can be detected by Tazama. For example, we invested a significant amount of our effort to create a comprehensive anti-scam typology to detect authorized push payments fraud. APP fraud is rapidly emerging as one of the biggest types of fraud impacting consumers today, with global losses estimated to be in excess of $1 trillion in 2024, according to a report by the Global Anti-Scam Alliance. Tazama can also detect behaviors that indicate account takeover and the duplication of payments to systematically drain an account or defraud a victim. We also created rules that rely on the enrichment of the ISO 20022 message with GPS data to evaluate geolocation-based typologies. Tazama also contains several rules and typologies that focus on unusual and suspicious transaction patterns by debtors and creditors. This slide describes an archetypical scam scenario that I am sure everyone is unfortunately very familiar with. Scammers send out millions of texts and emails to trick unsuspecting, trusting, scared, or desperate people into paying money into the scammer's account. Based on trends, many people fall for these scams and end up sending money to the scammers. The scammer's immediate concern then is to move the money from the receiving account, typically simply a mule account, into other accounts, or to exchange the funds into other instruments of value such as cash, gift cards, high value goods, and eventually reintroduce the funds back into the network as clean money. When we assess this type of scam, we can identify a number of behaviors that may arouse our suspicions. We can evaluate behavior by the debtor to see if they are vulnerable in some way or if they are showing transaction patterns that are out of character for them. We can also evaluate behavior by the creditor, and in particular, we check to see if the creditor is showing signs of money laundering. Every scammer is eventually a money launderer, so we rely on money laundering behaviors as well to detect fraud. On the side of the debtor, we always check to see if the debtor is making a payment to someone new for the first time. This is such an important and strong indicator for fraud that some payments regulators are suggesting that first-time transactions should be deliberately delayed to give the debtor a cooling-off period to reconsider the transaction. Unfortunately, a first-time payment is also a very common, everyday transaction. We all make payments to new creditors all the time, and issuing a suspicious transaction alert on the strength of just this one behavior will result in an overwhelming number of false positive results. For this reason, Tazama considers multiple rules in the evaluation of a typology and is able to produce more accurate evaluations. On the side of the debtor, we check if the debtor is making more payments than usual, or payments for greater amounts than usual. We can check if the debtor falls into a more vulnerable category, perhaps due to their age or circumstances. On the side of the creditor, we check if the creditor is receiving a large number of transactions from different people, or if they are receiving transactions with similar amounts, or amounts ending in round numbers, or amounts that look like they are made up. We look for transaction mirroring in the creditor's history where they have received money into their account and then immediately paid that money to someone else. The fact the creditor has multiple accounts in their name may be unusual in a particular network, and we can check what the creditor does with the money they've received and maybe detect an improbable proportion of cash withdrawals. In Tazama, we create rule processors to evaluate all of these behaviors, and then we compose the results of the rule processors into scenarios or typologies to determine if the sum of the behaviors are suspicious. The rule processors deliver the results of each of the behavioral evaluations to the typology processor individually as the results are completed. Each rule processor classifies their detected behaviors into a low, medium, and high-risk category. For example, here, we can see that mirroring behavior was detected, and here, we can see that this is the first time this debtor had paid this creditor. These individual rule results are passed to the typology processor for scoring, and a weighted score is assigned to reflect the severity of the impact of a particular rule result on a particular typology. Rule results are collected one at a time and cached until all rule results for a typology have been delivered. With all the rule results in hand, the typology processor adds the weighted scores together into a total and then evaluates the total against the investigation and interdiction thresholds configured for the typology to determine if any action is required. In this example, Tazama has accumulated sufficient evidence of fraudulent behavior to recommend that the transaction should be blocked. The rule processor results classifications here, the typology-specific weightings here, and the typology-specific thresholds here are all configurable within Tazama to keep the system up to date with evolving fraud patterns and behaviors. We will now take you through a brief demonstration of Tazama's capabilities and show you how the system detects fraud and money laundering. Due to its nature as an engine, Tazama's capabilities are a little difficult to demonstrate, and we developed this web-based user interface for us and our partners to showcase Tazama's features. For our demonstration today, we're going to illustrate a simple fraud scenario where a victim is making multiple payments to a scammer. Let's create our accounts. On the left, we'll create a mule account for the scammer, and then the scammer's account where the money will eventually end up. And then we'll create two victims here. We want our mule account and our scammer to be able to receive funds, so we'll drag them over here to the creditor side as well. Now, let's make a payment from this victim to the mule account here. We'll create a new transaction from the debtor's device. Let's say our victim is scammed for an amount of $200. Let's send the money to the scammer. Tazama now intercepts the transaction and performs an evaluation in real time. You can see the results of the evaluation on the dashboard here below. On the left are the results of the various rule processors, and on the right are the results of the typology evaluations. At this point in the customer life cycles, Tazama has not accumulated enough history to be able to make an accurate assessment of the behaviors to determine if the transaction is suspicious. Some of the rule processors did signal some suspicious behavior, but none of the combined rule results carried sufficient weight to trigger a typology yet. Both the debtor and the creditor are new to the network, and the only history that is available for evaluation is the transaction that was just performed. But as you can see here, the rules did pick up some behaviors that may be suspicious. For example, this rule detected that ever-critical behavior to indicate that this is the first time that the debtor made a payment to this particular creditor. However, none of the typologies that rely on this rule accumulated enough evidence from their other rules to flag the transaction as suspicious. Now, let's create another payment from our second victim here. We'll create another new transaction from the other victim's device. Let's say this victim is also scammed for an amount of $200. Send. The outcome of this evaluation is pretty much the same as before, and also expected since these entities are all still relatively new to the ecosystem. However, you can see here that the Rule 45 is accumulating history, and the rule result shows that the creditor has now received two transactions. Okay, so our scammer has now defrauded two victims in rapid succession, and the money must now leave the scene of the crime before the scam is reported and the mule account is shut down. The scammer now makes a payment from the mule account into the scammer's account. We'll create a new transaction here and then update the amount to reflect the total, $400, of the two amounts stolen from the two victims. We now see some different lights on our evaluation dashboard down below. Immediately, we can see that there is an investigation alert for typology 11. When we click on the light, we can see from the description of the typology that Tazama has detected suspicious behavior related to the immediate remittance or transfer of funds once they are deposited into an account. When we click on the typology, we can also see all the rules that were used in the evaluation of this particular typology. Of particular interest is this rule result here that indicates that the debtor had performed a mirroring transaction. Here we can now see the detection of a key money laundering behavior. Tazama detected that the debtor had received a number of payments and then made a payment to a different account for the total amount of those incoming payments. Now let's see what happens if our first victim here makes another payment into the scammer's mule account. Excellent. Tazama has detected sufficient evidence of a suspected fraudulent transaction and has recommended that the transaction should be blocked. On the right, we can see that Tazama alerted on typology 95 here. This typology detected a duplicate transaction from the debtor's account. With the typology selected, we can see the rules that identified behaviors that contributed to this typology. The transaction mirroring we had previously detected as a money laundering behavior is now showing up again against the mule account. We can also see here the weighted contribution of this behavior to the typology. In addition to the mirroring, Tazama also detected a payment from the debtor to the same creditor with this rule here. The weighted contributions of the rules are added together in the typology processor and matched against the threshold set up for the typology. We can see here that the total score for this typology is 700, which is greater or equal to the interdiction threshold configured here for blocking the transaction. And that is how Tazama works to detect fraud and keep your customers and their money safe. In summary, with Tazama, you have the ability to detect fraud and money laundering behavior in real time, which then allows you to take immediate action to keep your customers safe. You can block suspicious transactions, call out for additional verifications and checks, conduct an investigation, or any activity dictated by your risk response policy. Each alert is presented with a detailed report that clearly articulates the reasons for the alerts. These reports will give investigators a head start in their investigations and will grant regulators clear insights into the functioning of the system. Tazama is able to protect the customers of a single institution, but can also be deployed centrally to protect the customers of multiple organizations across an entire financial ecosystem, all the way up to country level. Tazama rules and typologies are configurable to adapt rapidly to evolving fraud trends so that you can stay a step ahead of the criminals. All the scores and thresholds you saw in the demo are configurable by your users through a secure configuration utility. And finally, as an open source software project in the Linux Foundation, you will join a community of like-minded operators to collaborate and share information to improve not only Tazama, but also your own efforts and capabilities to prevent fraud in your ecosystems. Thank you for joining us for this presentation of Tazama.